Ever feel like, whoa, the world is just spinning faster and faster? You finally think you're getting a grip, and bam, something comes out of nowhere and throws everything off.
It's true. It's like the rule book got tossed out the window.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. How to not just survive, but actually thrive in this kind of world. We're looking at Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal.
Perfect example, right? Because he was dealing with this firsthand leading special forces in Iraq against al-Qaeda.
Talk about high stakes.
Absolutely. And one of the things that McChrystal realized early on was that the old playbooks, the rigid structures, they just weren't cutting it against an enemy like al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Right, because this is a whole different ballgame.
Totally. Al-Qaeda, they were adaptable, fast-moving, and incredibly difficult to pin down using those traditional tactics.
Right, trying to catch smoke. Right.
Exactly.
McChrystal actually opens the book with this really gripping anecdote.
Oh, yeah.
So picture this. Baghdad, 2004. You've got this team of U.S. Special Forces, the best of the best, and they're planning a mission. Every single detail is mapped out, every contingency, you name it. And then AQI, they just pull a total 180.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because this is about more than just things being difficult. This is about complexity. That one small change can spiral into these huge, totally unpredictable outcomes. Even the best laid plans.
Gone in an instant. And this isn't just some military thing, you know. This is everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. Every day.
You ever see those massive domino displays?
Yeah.
One tiny nudge and the whole pattern shifts.
And you can't predict it.
Exactly. Work projects, travel plans, it's like that butterfly effect in action.
Totally. And often it's the structures we create, for efficiency, they actually end up working against us. Like the U.S. military, powerful, organized, but they were struggling against AQI, in part because of that very structure.
It's like the opposite of what you'd think.
Right. You'd assume that would be their strength, that rigid hierarchy, but against an enemy like AQI.
It was like wearing heavy armor trying to fight someone who's nimble and fast.
Exactly. Because they were built for a completely different kind of war. One with clear front lines, predictable enemies. This was something else entirely.
So how do you go from that kind of massive machine to something agile enough to actually counter an enemy as fluid as AQI? That's the million-dollar question.
Right, and that's where McChrystal had this breakthrough. He called it LIMFAC, short for limiting factor. And in this situation, it was their own structure, what they thought was their biggest asset.
It was actually their Achilles heel.
Exactly. Imagine a game of telephone, but each department's a silo, only talking to the one above and below them.
Oh man, I can see where this is going.
By the time information reached the POP, it was often outdated, incomplete, not helpful.
Too little, too late.
And the disconnect had real consequences.
It's like that whole thing with General Motors and that faulty ignition switch, right?
Exactly. It wasn't that they didn't care about safety. It was a communication breakdown. Silos not talking to each other.
And tragically, those real-world consequences. McChrystal really drives home this point. In this new world, we need to shift from a need to know to a need to share.
100%.
So this leads us to his big idea, the team of teams approach.
Which, to be clear, isn't just your typical rah-rah teamwork stuff.
No, not even close. This is different.
It's about taking the best of both worlds. You've got those smaller, agile teams like your special forces units, but they're all interconnected. Information flows freely. Trust is paramount.
So less hierarchy, more like a network, right? Like all these different nodes all talking to each other.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be so crucial in that kind of unpredictable setting.
It's about breaking down those silos and building a shared understanding, a shared consciousness across the entire organization.
And McChrystal actually started putting this into practice in Iraq, right?
Yeah, he did. He started having these daily operations and intelligence briefings. So imagine this. Analysts, frontline, soldiers, everyone, all in the same room, getting the same real-time updates.
No more information silos. Everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And they took it a step further with this embedding program.
Embedding.
Yeah, so they'd take people from one unit and send them to live and work with another unit, sometimes for months.
Wow. Talk about getting out of your comfort zone.
Right. It forced people to see things from different perspectives, understand the challenges and constraints other parts of the organization were facing, build empathy.
Because when you're in the trenches together, you gain a whole new level of understanding.
Exactly. It wasn't always easy, but it built that trust, that shared understanding, which is crucial because shared awareness is great, but you have to be able to act on it, right?
Yeah. Right. This is where that empowered execution comes in, giving individuals on the ground the authority to make decisions. using that shared knowledge.
Exactly. In that kind of rapidly changing environment, waiting for orders from the top, well, could be disastrous.
You've got to be able to adapt on the fly.
McChrystal realized he couldn't micromanage every single decision. He had to trust his team to act with the best information they had.
I can imagine that was a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Oh, for sure. It requires a whole other level of trust.
It makes you realize, though, this idea of having to make tough calls with limited information, it's not new.
No, not at all.
Think about the U.S. Navy back in the 1850s.
Right.
Once those ships were at sea, communication, well, it was spotty at best. So those captains, they were given a lot of leeway to act independently. They had to make judgment calls based on whatever information they had.
Exactly.
And it really highlights how these challenges, they're not new, it's just the context that's different.
Right.
We might have more information available now than ever, but that core need to act decisively, to be adaptable in the face of uncertainty.
That never changes.
That's a constant. And that's a really important takeaway for all of us, no matter what we do.
100%.
How do we create those environments where people feel empowered to make decisions,
Right.
to take calculated risks without needing someone to give them permission every step of the way?
Right. It's finding that balance.
Control versus autonomy.
Exactly.
That idea of empowered execution is fascinating, especially in that kind of pressure cooker environment. They were facing a very real enemy with very real consequences.
Right. And what's fascinating about their hunt for Zarqali, he was leading AQI at the time, is that it wasn't just about, brute force.
It was about strategy.
McChrystal's team, they had to outsmart them, understand that network, almost anticipate their moves.
It's like that chess game we were talking about earlier. But the board is constantly shifting, pieces moving in ways you wouldn't expect. How do you even begin to wrap your head around that, let alone counter it?
It required a completely different way of thinking. So instead of just focusing on, capturing individuals, they had to figure out a way to dismantle that entire network.
The whole structure.
Taking out one leader wasn't enough. They had to disrupt the flow of everything. Information, resources, the whole thing. Everything that allowed AQI to function.
So it became less about eliminating specific targets and more about understanding that whole ecosystem, how it all connected and interacted.
Exactly. They had to become experts on AQI, almost.
Know your enemy.
And that meant analyzing massive amounts of data. We're talking intelligence reports, communication intercepts, even chatter on social media.
Trying to put together this giant puzzle.
With pieces coming from all over the place.
And I bet those pieces didn't always fit together neatly right away.
Right. Of course not. But that's where those aha moments come in. You find this tiny little detail in one report, and it doesn't mean much on its own, but then you connect it with something from a totally different source, and boom.
It clicks.
Exactly.
Suddenly you've got a new lead, a new insight.
And a lot of times, those connections were the key to cracking AQI's operations wide open.
Okay, so they're building this crazy, detailed understanding of this network, but how does that translate to action? It's one thing to know how the enemy operates, but you still have to actually stop them.
And that's where empowered execution really comes into play. So once they had that solid understanding of the network, McChrystal actually empowered his teams to act on it, often with a level of autonomy that you just wouldn't see in a traditional military structure.
So less waiting for orders from the top and more taking the initiative based on the information they had in the moment.
Exactly. And that agility, that was everything. They could identify and respond to threats so much faster, disrupt those communication lines, even anticipate and prevent attacks before they happened.
All because those teams on the ground had the freedom to act.
It all goes back to that neural network idea. Each part acting independently, but completely in sync with the whole.
I'm really seeing how all of this connects. But it's easy to get caught up in the military context. What can the average person, someone who isn't facing down, terrorists, what can they take away from McChrystal's experience?
That's what's so great about this. It's applicable across the board. The thing is, we all operate within these complex systems, whether we realize it or not. Businesses, communities, even our own personal lives. And the principles are the same. You build that shared understanding of the system, break down those silos, and then you empower people to act on the information they have.
So step one, become a student of your own environment. Pay attention to those connections, those cause and effect relationships.
Right. Get curious. And don't be afraid to seek out information from different places. Talk to people in other departments, read reports, whatever it takes.
Connect those dots.
You'll be amazed at what you start to see.
It's about finding those aha moments in your own world.
Exactly. And once you've got that understanding, empower your team. Delegate responsibility, give them the autonomy to make decisions.
That can be tough, though. Letting go of control, it's easier said than done.
It definitely takes conscious effort,
Mm.
but it's about trusting your team, giving them the space to learn and grow, even if it means a few bumps in the road.
Because ultimately, it's not about being the one with all the answers. It's about creating that environment where those answers can bubble up organically.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole approach so powerful. It's about creating a culture of adaptability, innovation, shared responsibility.
Which then creates those more effective, more resilient organizations and individuals. We've talked a lot about how important this mindset shift is, but let's get practical. How do we actually put these ideas into practice? Go from theory to action, as they say.
Right, because it's one thing to talk about, breaking down silos and all that, but actually doing it,
Putting it into practice is a whole other thing.
people fall back into old habits so easily.
It's comfortable.
Exactly. One really effective way to do this is to create these cross-functional teams. You bring together people from different departments, have them work on projects that need that holistic view.
So, like, if you're in marketing, don't just stay in your marketing bubble. Reach out to sales, to product development.
Right. Understand their challenges, their perspective.
Get the bigger picture.
And just as important as forming those connections is making information accessible. Transparency is key.
Everyone's on the same page.
Regular meetings, shared online platforms, whatever helps people get the information they need to make good decisions.
Shifting from that need to know to that need to share mentality.
100%. And then once that information is flowing, that's when you empower your team to actually use it.
Give them that authority to make the calls, take those risks.
And accept that there will be mistakes.
It's a learning process.
Exactly. But that requires trust. Right. Trust in your team, trust in the process.
Otherwise, it all falls apart.
And that's where leadership comes in. It's a fundamental shift. You go from this top-down command and control approach to something much more collaborative, more decentralized. And that brings us to the critical role of leadership in building a successful team of teams.
So we're talking about really changing how we think about what it means to be a leader. It's less about barking orders and more about setting the stage.
Right. It's about empowering others to lead, really. In fact, there's this interesting example McChrystal talks about from back in the 1960s, this organization called LDO, the European Launcher Development Organization.
Yeah, Chief.
Right. They were trying to build a rocket to compete with NASA.
Ambitious.
Totally. But they just kept hitting these roadblocks, couldn't get anything off the ground.
Sounds familiar. What went wrong?
Silos, mainly. Each country involved, they all wanted to control their own little piece. Ah, the classic too many cooks scenario.
Exactly. They weren't sharing information effectively, which led to, well, you name it, miscommunication, duplicated effort, just a real lack of coordination.
So they're trying to build a rocket, but they're structured like a committee. I can see why they weren't reaching orbit.
Exactly. And then you have NASA, on the other hand, who managed to put a man on the moon in under 10 years.
Talk about a moonshot.
Right. And McChrystal argues that a big part of it wasn't just the technology, but the organizational structure. NASA, they really embraced systems thinking.
Meaning?
They understood that to launch that rocket successfully, every single part had to work together perfectly.
It all comes back to that shared consciousness. It's not enough to just have a bunch of smart people. They have to be on the same page, working towards that shared goal. Exactly. And having that clear vision for how to get there, that's a huge part of leadership, especially in this team of teams environment, being able to really articulate that why behind the what.
So it's not just telling people what to do, but inspiring them, showing them the bigger picture, getting them excited about what's possible when everyone works together.
Exactly. And then, crucially, trusting them to figure out the how.
Letting go of that need to micromanage.
It's tough.
Oh, I bet. But like we've been saying, in this kind of world, that ability to adapt, to be agile, it comes from empowered people, not from rigid structures.
100%. And this is something I think everyone listening can think about. Have you ever experienced this firsthand, where this kind of approach really worked? What were those key elements? Or, on the flip side, if you've been stuck in those siloed environments, what was missing? What could have been done differently?
Taking these concepts and seeing how they apply to our own work, our own lives. Because this isn't just some theory. It's about building stronger, more effective teams, no matter what you're working towards.
And it's important to remember, building a team of teams, it's not like you do it once and you're done. It's an ongoing process. It takes constant communication, being willing to adapt, to learn as you go.
It's about embracing that constant change we were talking about earlier. This world isn't slowing down for anyone, so we have to be ready to move with it. And that means fostering those qualities in ourselves and the people around us.
Absolutely. Be adaptable, be open to new ideas, and trust your team. Those are the keys to not just surviving, but really thriving in a complex world.
We covered a lot of ground today, from the streets of Baghdad to, well, outer space.
Quite the journey.
But that core message is so clear. Shared consciousness, empowered execution, adaptable leadership. Those are the things that matter, especially in a world that feels as unpredictable as ours can sometimes feel.
And it's a continuous journey. But by really embracing these principles, we can all do our part to build those more resilient, more innovative, more successful teams. It's possible.
That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building those incredible teams.